Hey there, I'm so glad you tuned in to Navigate. We are back after a spring and summer interlude, and I've missed interacting with our guests and our audience, and I trust that wherever you are and whatever has transpired in your life, you're experiencing God's peace and strength in greater measure. Hey, big news on the Austin front is that we are officially empty nesters. We're so proud of our youngest daughter, Emma, for finishing high school well in spite of the COVID-19 related challenges and launching out on a gap year missions adventure. That's the new normal that her mom and I are adjusting to. Diminished capacity is a real thing, especially in seasons of transition when the unknowns are many. And maybe your reserves were already low, and then COVID-19 hit. And maybe all the unsettledness has left you feeling distracted or confused as to what's really important. And we start wondering during these times, am I enough? Do I have enough to finish the race? Dealing with uncertainty can leave us feeling depleted. And even when we have energy, we're not sure where to focus our efforts. So whatever the case, there are some real life lessons and growth opportunities to be had in these times. And that's what Navigate's all about. Discovering growth opportunities in times of change. Tina Stoltzfus Horst is my guest today. She has a personal story of walking through a season of diminished capacity even before COVID-19 hit, and she also has a testimony of how God met her there. And I know you'll be encouraged by this conversation today. Tina is a coach, trainer, and author currently living in Goshen, Indiana. She's married to Gary, mom of 2 adult children, and lives in the country with a large dog and lots of wildflowers. Sounds nice. Tina is passionate about empowering cross-cultural leaders and has coached and trained leaders around the world for over 20 years. She's the founder of Coaching Mission International, a nonprofit providing coaching and coach training to the missions world, and the author of Dancing Between Cultures, Culturally Intelligent Coaching for Missions and Ministry. So welcome to the show, Tina Stoltzfus Horst. All right. Well, hey, Tina, welcome to, and thank you for being part of the Navigate podcast and agreeing to sit with me for a while and have a conversation.
Thanks, Tim. It's an honor to be with you.
Yeah, I'm just really, really pleased that we could reconnect. It's been a while, but we go back a ways. I was one of your trainees in my original foundational coaching training. And so you have had a big impact on my, I guess you could say my trajectory over the past 5 years or so. Once I started coaching training, it just it was super instrumental as God used that to really redirect some of my own efforts and focus on ministry and how, God was preparing me for the next season. So, yeah, thank you for your investment.
You're welcome. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah. Well, hey, I'm super excited. We're just going to talk a little bit about your journey and some of the things that you've discovered along the way. And I'm really excited about this particular podcast because I think that it's going to help. It's going to give a taste of coaching. And what I plan to do is to do a series of podcasts around coaching with other coaches, with those who are being coached, just to see how impactful and life-changing coaching can be. So you've written a whole book on cross-cultural coaching, which we're going to talk about as well. So, but just first of all, before we get into that, tell our listeners something about you and your journey, either current or past or whatever you want.
Well, I'm the founder of Coaching Mission International, which is an organization that provides coaching and coach training for missions. So that's our connection, Tim.
Yes.
Training you talked about.
Right.
So I think I'll talk a little bit about what the last couple of years has been like for me. After 13 years of working at establishing and building and directing the CMI ministry, which I loved with all my heart and felt so called to, I just got really worn out. I was working outside of my gift area. I was really tired. I had some stressful relationships. And in 2017, I stepped back from my director role. And we were so excited, and I'm still very excited about our new executive director, John Taylor.
Mm-hmm.
But I think about 6 months into that transition, maybe a little bit farther, I got really sick. I had the flu a couple times, respiratory thing. I had, a couple rounds of medicine and just a lot of stress. And I ended up kind of having a health meltdown. Yeah, in about 2.5 months, I lost 30 pounds. I was in pain every day, all day, lots of tests, lots of diagnoses, not any real progress. And I kind of gradually just lost functioning. I was tired all the time. I had a bout of anxiety. I got to the point where I couldn't take care of myself. I didn't have the energy to do much at all. Yeah, so it's been a very long journey to regain my health. And I think it's been a place where God has met me over the last 2 years. It's a place where I've seen his goodness and his creativity, but it's been a really painful time and a time of grief and loss too.
Yeah. Wow. And so that kind of that transition started in 2017, you said. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So what are some places, if you don't mind me asking, what are some places where God has met you in that? Because it sounds like some valley times, some pretty dark seas, some pretty dark times. So I'm just kind of curious, what are some places God has met you there? Because we know he meets us in those places.
He absolutely meets us in those places. If I think about like life lessons for me, two of them are big. One of them was, excuse me, just being able to focus in on the small gifts every day. To just give you a picture of my daily life for about 9 to 12 months, most of the day I was sitting in my recliner. My husband was at work. I was watching the birds. My brain was not clear enough to be able to, sometimes I couldn't read or even watch a television program to the end. I was just, I just was so tired and had so much brain fog and so much pain that I just couldn't connect. I remember at one point somebody said, well, why don't you learn a language during this time? You're at home and you're not working right now. And this would be a great time for you to learn something. And I just laughed. It's like, learn something. I don't have the capacity for that.
That sounds exhausting.
It was exhausting. And so just trying to find, even in those times where I was really in pain, of focusing in and saying, okay, God, what's the gift today? Yeah. Like, what's the one thing of beauty that you're giving me today that I can just celebrate and be grateful for? So maybe it was my husband giving me a long hug before he left for work, or maybe it was a text from a friend that just really hit the nail on the head, or maybe it was looking at a flower through my window, or hearing the birds sing in the morning. Often it was something really simple and small. Yeah. But just identifying those things every day. I would keep a journal and I would religiously write down something every day and intentionally take time to thank God for it. So that was one of the things. I think another lesson for me was letting go. And those lessons started before I got sick, with letting go of my executive director role at CMI. But I feel like God just took me to a new place of being able to trust him in not being able to do anything. Tim, I just really like to do things. I like to produce things. I like to cross things off my action list. I'm a doer.
Yeah. Wow. And so for that, those people who are wired that way, those personality types, being just like you're saying here, kind of being able just to rest and to savor the moment, to be in the moment, present. Yeah, it can be a real challenge. But and, and I'm thinking about our current environment now, and you transitioned, and we're dealing with these health issues that kept you confined to home for a big part of your day before COVID-19 hit, right? So tell me a little bit about that and how that, that season may have or not prepared you kind of for this current environment that we're living in now. Maybe it didn't feel any different.
In a lot of ways, it was real interesting. I was just getting to the point where I was getting out more. I was working some. I was thinking maybe I could go back to church, and then COVID hit. So I think, there's a lot of things in my mind as you asked me that question. I was wearing a mask long before everybody else was in the U.S. Every time I went outside, I was putting myself at risk. And so living with that sense of risk, of fear, of uncertainty, I lived with that for a long time. Like, am I going to get well? How long is it going to take? What's going to happen next? Am I going to be able to live through the next phase of this illness? Even to the point of like, how much pain am I going to have an hour from now? Living with that kind of uncertainty is something that I feel like was a big part of what was happening for me. And I think right now during the pandemic, we're all living with that. We're all living with that uncertainty, with some of that fear. It's an uncertain time. And so embracing that, like, that is normal to feel that uncertainty and fear and anxiety. They're just feelings, and we can choose what to do with them. It's okay.
Yeah.
So having grace with myself, talking to God about it, giving that grace to others, that's been important. I think too, sorry.
Well, I was just thinking about the whole living with uncertainty piece. And isn't certainty so much a part of our wanting to control life, and kind of in many ways an illusion, and I think that's what the Lord has to take us through, especially those of us who are who are more wired that way, to be in control, to feel like we have to be one step ahead of the game, or whatever you want to, what I'm saying. And I think that what a valuable lesson to learn, living with uncertainty. And then comes COVID-19. And then, as you reflect back on all of this, I'm sure that there's been some powerful life lessons learned just in this area of living with uncertainty. And how are you going to take that and move forward into the new thing that God has for you? That's a question, by the way.
It's a good question. And I think one of the things that I've said to people now that I've regained a certain measure of health and gone through a lot of different stages with my staff role and finally resigning that just a few months ago, I feel like God gave me the gift of freedom, and it's not the gift that I asked for or that I wanted. I didn't want the gift of freedom from responsibilities, but that's the gift I received. And so I want to be able to be grateful for that gift, and I want to celebrate what God gives. And so that's part of, I think, the lesson for me and for those of us who love to be in control and get things done. The letting go of that, there is a freedom that comes, and there's definitely greater trust in others and greater trust in God when you have to let go, but there's also freedom. Yeah. And that's something to rejoice in. It can feel foreign and different. Yes,
for sure. Yeah, very much so. And free, but there is a freedom through letting go, like you're saying. And I think that that's a real powerful lesson to learn. And then that creates space for us to be able to consider what could be options and possibilities. It opens up a whole new area of potential and opportunity as we think creatively with God, of course, through that season. So I'm just thinking of all the people that are out there, dealing with uncertainty, and it's it's, and it just going back to the fact that life is always uncertain to an extent, but this has brought a whole new level of people being in limbo, transition, not knowing what's next, not knowing how to get back to where they were. All of that combined just really can create a lot of angst and
Yes.
discouragement. And to hear you saying that was a life lesson and is a life lesson. I hope that, we can just encourage our listeners today around that. This can be a really great life lesson that can open up a whole vista of new, opportunity for you as you look to the Lord in this.
I think that's right, Tim. And I think that recognizing and hanging on to that promise that God gives us, that he does bring good out of things that the enemy intends for evil.
Yeah.
I think that's something that's really important to go back to over and over again. And I just think about the isolation, too, that many people are living in right now. I know that when I was ill, my world got very small. And I think many of us feel like our world has gotten smaller right now.
Yeah.
One thing you and I had going into the COVID crisis is, as coaches who worked virtually, we've learned how to cultivate authentic relationships over distance.
Okay.
So even though I felt isolated during that time, and I know that God often uses isolation in our lives to bring internal growth, I think that finding ways to keep relationships vital when we feel isolated. And some of us, of course, are more isolated than others. Some of us live in regions where there's still modifications of lockdowns happening, and some of us feel very free right now. But I think cultivating those authentic, vulnerable relationships, oh my goodness, that's so important. It's important with God, and it's important with others.
Okay, that's really, really key, I think. And what you're saying is that can be accomplished via Skype or Zoom or online. We can cultivate authentic relationship in that way. And I think a lot I that I talk to, and even myself, you get to a point where you say, I've been there, I've tried that, but it's not the same. And especially, I think, depends on, your personality type and how you're wired. Some of us are really, drawn to the face-to-face and want that connection. But you're saying that this can be done. And this really does seem like a lifeline during this time that we're in.
It was a lifeline for me, and it still is.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't substitute for somebody bringing you dinner or coming over and giving you a hug.
Right.
But you can have deep, vulnerable, meaningful conversations with people over phone or over Zoom. One of the beautiful things our family has done in the last few months is we've established a family Zoom call with each side of the family. My side does it more frequently than Gary's side does. But I think that's it's increased connection between our family members who are spread out all over the U.S. and part of Europe.
Yeah.
To just have that time to connect with each other, I really feel like it's been enriching for us.
Yeah. So a good thing, I think, for our listeners, if you're out there and you're wondering how could this work, or you're feeling stuck and disconnected, and just think of one relationship that you can cultivate, even if it's online, just something that will begin to, and it could be a past relationship. It could be somebody new, but it could be something you need to either renew a relationship or to initiate something new. But I think that really has been helpful for me as well, Tina. I can do it as a coach, but I can also do it as a friend to somebody. And, and I think that's a friend or colleague, just somebody that, like you're saying, family members as well, just ways to stay connected during this season. Super important. Yeah. I wanted to ask you, this goes back to this whole connection piece. So maybe we'll just stay on this theme actually here. But with all this isolation, are there any other ways that you have found that have been helpful to find connection and contentment?
I think that as I think back to my illness, one of the lifelines for me was a really small group of women who prayed for me. And, getting a text from one of them every once in a while, just a few words, it just meant the world to me,
That's
to
good.
not feel alone.
Yeah.
And I think we can do that for each other. It's so easy. It's so easy to reach out to just let somebody know that you're thinking about them.
Mm-hmm.
And that can make all the difference in the world to somebody who's really struggling right now.
That's good. Yeah. Good. Yeah. And I was thinking about the group, you mentioned getting together in groups, small groups, outdoors, things like that people can do safely and engage, even recreational type things. My wife, for example, when you mentioned group, this came to mind, but my wife, for example, she's the women ministries director at our church, and she has connection with some other women's ministries leaders in other churches in our county. And so she just put the invitation out. Hey, we have a couple paddle boards, and so we like to go out paddle boarding and on the lake here. We have a lake real close to our house. So she just put the invitation out, and she had about 4 or 5 ladies that said, yes, we'd love to do this. So every other Monday they go out and paddleboard on the lake. And what a great way to connect.
Love it.
Yeah. Well, great way to connect and to build relationship and in a safe and engaging way, So there's, and I'm thinking like book studies, online book studies and things like that. Or if you can do it safely, books, small group book studies where you're at, face to face, but things that just to, and it does take initiative. It does take wanting that and figuring out how to pursue that, in a good way. So, great tips. And I am challenged even as I think about how I can connect more with people. My times of connecting with a couple close friends kind of got sabotaged during COVID-19. So I'm having to rethink all of that. So what I can do on a regular basis to be, as iron sharpens iron, we need that connection. We need that relationship.
Yeah.
Well, how about we shift gears and talk about your book? You're a coach, and so you're also a cross-cultural coach, and you have done a lot of coaching cross-culturally. And you actually wrote a book about that. And the book is called Dancing Between Cultures. So tell me a little bit about what prompted you to write the book and a little bit about what it's about.
Well, Dancing Between Cultures came about after working with missionaries for a while and just learning so much from coaching and from my coaching and training clients. Just realizing the depth of the differences that are often beneath the surface that we're not aware of when it comes to culture. It was just so fascinating. I feel like my eyes were opened in ways that I had just never really understood before. I really feel like this is part of the beauty of God and his character in the world that's just expressed through different cultures and different cultural values. So I think one thing that struck me fairly early on in my work with CMI is that many missionaries seem to understand pretty deeply the culture that they were living in, and they had adapted to it. They were comfortable in it, but they actually didn't understand the bigger picture of culture. So when they came home or when they had to change assignments and go to a different country, or they started working with a multicultural team, they would have to start over learning all these details about culture. Well, this is how you do this, and this is how you talk about this, and this is how you address people, and this is how you don't.
Right.
But those of us who coach or work in multicultural settings or multicultural teams or multicultural communities, which more and more we do, it's just impossible to learn all the details. You just can't do it. So instead of learning the details, you can learn the concepts. You can learn about the sets of values that underlie every culture. And you can become culturally intelligent and literate enough so that you can transition, or this is where the title of the book comes in, dance between cultures more agilely. And so I get really passionate about that. I would love to see every Christian leader be culturally intelligent. Our world is becoming multicultural increasingly. And so I think this is a key skill for leaders.
Great. Yeah. So what I'm hearing you say is that you obviously underwent some initial coach training, but then as you got into coaching, and specifically coaching cross-culturally, you realized that some of those tools, while they are across the board, are for coaches great tools, but there were some other areas that training possibly didn't cover, and that you could bring to the coaching world in the form of additional training and actually this book that you. So there were some things were highlighted for you in the process of coaching.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. I'm an American,
Mm-hmm.
and many of my early clients were South Asian. When I first started coaching missionaries. Okay. And I just learned a tremendous amount from these leaders about their own cultures. Indians, Nepali, Korean. It was just such a rich experience of recognizing, oh, well, okay, here's this coaching value, but it doesn't actually work the same way in their culture that it works in mine. So what do I need to do to adapt how I talk about this and how I work with this value? And how do I learn to have grace and accept how that's going to be in my client's culture than it is in mine? Even how do I talk to my clients differently? How does the coaching conversation look different? Those were all revelations to me early on.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And so on your website, so there's a website, I believe it's dancingbetweencultures.com. Is that correct?
Yep, that's it.
Yeah, dancingbetweencultures.com. You can go there. But on your website, you share a resource, and it's called the Cross-Cultural Values Chart. And one area of contrasting values that you highlight there is autonomy versus community, that whole autonomy community area that and I just would like you to maybe explain what that looks like. What are we talking about when we're talking about autonomy and community? Tell me more about that and how it might be a helpful way to even deal with abrupt transitions, that we're going through.
I love to talk about this stuff.
Okay.
So the autonomy community value set is about where we find identity. So it's a really important one. It's one of the big top two value sets, I think. The other one being status and equality, about how we do society. But this one is about where we find our identity and where we think responsibility lies. So if we are from an autonomy culture, or we've adapted to an autonomy culture, we unconsciously feel that our identity is rooted in our individuality. So that means my choices determine my destiny. I'm responsible for my own decisions. My relationships are based a lot on my circumstances. But if I'm from a community culture, or I've adapted to one, my identity comes from group membership. So then I think about destiny as being a result of circumstances, or birth, or group membership, or background. And I value interdependence and making decisions together. So this has so many implications for so many things. But when we're thinking about abrupt transition, and I'm thinking now particularly about people during this pandemic, maybe they had to come home from an assignment, or they've lost their job, or they're a mom and all of a sudden their kids are home all day long. If you're community oriented, a bunch of things can happen during an abrupt transition. You might adjust more quickly, since you won't struggle as much with thinking that this transition is a personal failure. So it was just a result of circumstance. I mean, it's just a pandemic.
Okay.
if you also lost your primary group in the transition, like if you're separated from them physically, this would be really, really difficult
Mm,
because you really value stable relationships and you want to make decisions together, and harmony within that group is so important. So, for instance, if you know a community culture person that's stuck in an autonomy culture during the pandemic, they may just feel this crippling sense of loneliness. Often this happens with exchange students that come from community cultures and they're just stuck into an autonomy college culture. It can be really, I just don't think as an autonomy person we get how difficult that is.
mm,
Um, then on the other side, if you're autonomy culture, you can adapt more quickly relationally because you don't have as, because you can just adapt to relationships based on your new job or your new circumstance or whatever is happening. But you can feel a lot of angst or guilt and feel like you failed, and about things that you really just don't have any control over at
mm.
all.
Okay.
So
That's huge. That whole disappointment over and sense of failure over things
yeah,
that we thought maybe we could control, but we couldn't.
yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So, I think about that mom whose kid is going to miss their senior year, or the
Right.
mission executive that had to bring all their people home. And, you know, recognizing that we, as autonomy culture people, we feel this sense of guilt or failure about something that really, I mean, it's a pandemic. It's
Right.
just, it's a circumstance and we don't have any control over it. So
Mm,
stop wasting time, and energy in life. I think one of the things that's so beautiful about understanding culture and becoming culturally intelligent is that you can learn and practice and draw from the opposite side of the culture continuum. And
mm.
so, if you are an autonomy culture person, you can learn to not have so much angst and sense of failure and guilt over things that you really don't have control over. You can learn how to draw on the community perspective. Um, I found it so fascinating, Tim, during this COVID-19 thing with masks and the whole, Asian culture is much more likely to be community oriented. And so it's so much easier to make a public health decision and just say, hey, do this for everybody else's good.
Yeah.
And in the States, we want to make decisions on our own and be independent. And so it's harder to get people to change behaviors
Right.
benefit them, to give up those behaviors and do something different for other people's good. And so just understanding those kinds of motivations under the surface is helpful for us in a time when there's lots of political division and polarizing, to be able to see the other side and find the good in it.
Right. Yeah, that's great. And I think of those, some of the global workers that are in transition right now. Some of them have had to leave the field abruptly and change. So they're going, many of them, from a community oriented culture
Yes.
to maybe back to their home country, which is autonomy centered. And so that's like when you're just plopped down in the middle of something so quick without even really having to process this. um, there's a lot of there can be a lot of confusion around that area
Yeah.
and how to navigate it. So just like you said, being aware, and I think by nature that um, global workers, missionaries all over the world, who have gone, who have crossed cultural boundaries and have navigated some of that, we're at a huge advantage
Yes.
in a lot of cases to have, because of that awareness. And if we just take time to process that and not let and find ways to deal with the frustration, the confusion, the angst over all the unpredictability and uncertainty in our own lives. I think we're at a real advantage just because of how we've been exposed and how we've entered into other people's worlds who are not like us, who are different from
Absolutely
us.
agree with that. I feel like during this time, cross-cultural workers, missionaries, we have so much to offer right now in helping people to understand those differences. And as cross-cultural coaches, we add the skill set of being able to talk to each other and help people to have fruitful conversations. So,
Good.
yeah.
It's good. Yeah. Great. Well, this is just to give a little teaser, a little bit to whet people's appetite for your book, Dancing Between Cultures. And are there, you mentioned status equality, and I don't know if you want to say something about that, but I was going to ask you, what are one or two other contrasting values that we may need to consider while working through transition, big change?
I think two of them that are really helpful to think about, and some of these are I have 6 of the 11 values that are in the book on my website. So you can find 6 of the values on the values chart on the website. These are 2 others that I think are really critical when you're working with change and planning. And those are crisis and non-crisis, that value set, and then risk and caution.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
And I think for people who are crisis and non-crisis have to do with planning. So some cultures value people who are great at improvising, and others are much more motivated on the other side of the value set to have a plan and see it through. So, a really obvious application here, if you're from a crisis culture and all of a sudden you have this huge abrupt change that you haven't had any control over and you don't have any time to plan for, it's extremely difficult. So then how do you draw from that non-crisis orientation, which is basically about improvising? You don't plan ahead, but when it happens, and you don't waste time on that planning, but when the crisis comes, you just improvise and trust God during that. And so there's a huge amount of positive in pulling from that other side of the value continuum. And Americans tend to be crisis oriented. We tend to want to plan ahead for crises and then follow the plan that we have. So the non-crisis value that you often see, like a really great example is island culture, just it is what it is, and we're in the day that we are, and we're just gonna enjoy the day we're in. There's a lot of contentment that comes in that.
Okay.
So there's also some downside, but right now during the pandemic, I think there's a bunch of upside.
Yeah. That has its advantages to be a little more laid back, if you will, around circumstances beyond our control, and realizing that I can get through this, and there's more ways. what a weird I don't know why I thought of this, but there's more ways to skin a cat. But what a weird saying, huh? Anyways, there's other options out there. I said it. I know. Okay, all you cat lovers out there, I was just joking. But yeah, to be able to say, okay, there's creative, and I think that what we need to do from a crisis orientation, many of us in our culture, in Western culture, where we like to plan ahead. But when when all your plans get derailed, and when all your great intentions and expectations feel like they've been sabotaged, what is helpful is I feel for us to go back and to pause, to put things on pause, to take time to reflect, because if we don't take the moment to reflect and get some creativity and creative thoughts around how we can move forward. And that's why I encourage people, work with, have these conversations with a coach, with a mentor, somebody that you can have these conversations with, because we get tunnel vision. And because my plan was this, and I can no longer do this. No other options, at least in our own, thinking. So what a great way and coaching, of course, is a great way to be able to do that, to open up the opportunity, the creative space to look at new options, creative ways of moving forward through transition.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So crisis, non-crisis, really, I can see why that can be really helpful to think in terms of that in this environment. What about risk caution? Tell me about that.
Risk and caution has to do with change
Okay.
and how quickly you can embrace change. So a risk value set would be, I valuing flexibility, valuing adaptability, embracing change and making decisions quickly, trying new things, thinking about changes and differences as interesting
Oh, okay.
instead of anxiety producing. So caution would be more on the other side, valuing reliability and preferring to have a long time to make decisions, not changing quickly and sticking with what's stable. So again, trying to draw from that in this particular climate that we're in right now, trying to draw from the risk value and say, okay, there's a lot of changes in my life right now. Those are interesting. What might God be doing in that?
Yeah.
Where's the potential there? And maybe I could try some things and not worry so much about whether they'll fail, but just try them and see if they'll work. I think being able to just give ourselves the freedom to practice something that feels different. I just, for a moment, going back to crisis, non-crisis, I will often say to my crisis clients who will tend to be pessimistic and anticipate potential problems to say, and I say this to myself as well, because I'm very crisis oriented, what's the best thing that could happen?
Good question.
What's the worst thing that could happen? What's the best thing that could happen?
Yeah.
Like, maybe all these potential problems that I've identified in my head, maybe those are actually not going to be relevant at all. And I could just think that things might turn out. They might just be fine. And actually, God's with me in this. And I really do believe he's going to bring something good out of it. So I'm not being pie in the sky. There's another American idiom there. I'm not just thinking about something that's crazy. I'm actually putting my trust in God that he can get me through something that I can't get myself through, or I can't get my family through. So I think there's real joy in being able to embrace a different way of thinking and a different way of making decisions during this time.
Good. Yeah. And like you said, giving ourselves the freedom to try something new, to try something different, even to ask that question, what's the best thing I can imagine? What's the ideal that I can actually imagine, and begin to think around those terms. And with all of the messages we're getting, in media and all the naysaying and all of the doom and gloom, man, we really need to protect that creative space.
Yes.
And in our own minds and hearts. And so I love that, what you're saying. I think that's super important. Protecting our hearts and minds from that by giving time to really think, okay, maybe these are some out of the box opportunities that I haven't considered before. It seems like as you were talking, these really overlap, the crisis, non-crisis, crisis, and risk caution values kind of overlap and move together sometimes.
Yes. Yeah, that's true.
Okay, well, I want to really encourage our listeners out there to get your book. Number one, go to your website. They can download that values chart, which is just a real great visual to help kind of take a look. And there's other values that we haven't mentioned on the podcast today that I think would be real helpful for our listeners to get an overview of. So, with so much, this kind of my, as we wrap up here, Tina, I just want to kind of ask you this question here. With so much uncertainty and loss in our world. I can't help but think that so many of our listeners are trying to make big life and career decisions. These are big. These are big changes for many of them. And so, what are some, besides anything we've mentioned today, what are some other tools and resources you might suggest to help them identify what is happening, kind of speak to that awareness piece, and then get clarity and move forward?
Oh, I have some good ideas, I think, to share. One of them I was just thinking about this weekend for myself, and this might seem counterintuitive in a time when we're already feeling isolated, but retreat time. I mean, we can just get so caught up with trying to make our everyday work in this new environment. And where's that set aside time for God? Sometimes it's really hard to find that. Even if we feel isolated from people, we're still, our brains are just going on problem solving all day. And so getting that time away just to listen, just to be with God, just to have that relationship, I think of it as sitting down and having coffee with Jesus. Is so important. We've mentioned coaching a number of times, but coaching from somebody who understands something of your background and values, debriefing coaching for people who made a transition recently. Spiritual direction is something that I've found important all of my life. There's just no substitute for somebody walking alongside of you, asking you those questions about what is God doing right now in your life, and what does that mean. I would, if you have made a transition home recently, I think looking at the cultural values chart and doing a particular exercise where you think about what are the values of the culture that I came from, what are the values of the culture I'm in now, and where do my own personal values lie? And think about the culture difference, like the amount of difference between your own personal values and the values of the culture you're in now, and the distance between the values of the culture you were in and the one that you're in now. That can often help us to understand where we're feeling confused or angry or alienated. And just understanding that can bring relief, makes you feel less crazy and sometimes less frustrated and angry. Well, a final one that I'd recommend is my brother Tony Stoltzfus's book, The Calling Journey. I think that I know for me personally, this has just been so important to understand the season in my leadership development as I make decisions, as I go through transitions. I really feel like it can be helpful to people in seasons of change and isolation to focus on what's God doing during this stage in your life, and then make decisions and move into transitions more confidently as a result.
That's great. I'm really glad you mentioned that, Tina. That's been an instrumental book for me, and also an activity that you can engage in as well. So the book is called The Calling Journey by Tony Stoltzfus. And if you go on, I believe, Tina, it's thecallingjourney.com, correct?
I think so.
I'm pretty, yeah. If you Google Calling Journey, but I think it's callingjourney.com, and it's a timeline builder activity on there. So you can actually map out your calling journey online. It's free to do. It's a great resource in addition to the book. So encourage our listeners as another resource to look into that. But to end on a high note, I love the fact that, that we're really the theme of this, dealing with uncertainty, is saying, hey, there's opportunity here. Yes, there's real challenges, but there's opportunity here, and God is still in control. So I'm excited. Just the fact that this can become something that will stimulate people's thinking and to be able to process their own transitions. Many of those transitions being really hard. So acknowledge the challenge, acknowledge the difficulty in that, and then find ways to move out of isolation and maybe in some cases, loneliness. We need support. We need companionship. We need the right kind of solitude. And I think that there's isolation and loneliness, but then there's a solitude that comes through finding our center again in Christ, and then moving forward from that. So really good conversation today. Thank you, Tina. Any last words of encouragement for our listeners out there before we sign off?
Another good question from a great coach. I just encourage all of you to look for the gift that God is giving in the difficulty, because there's always a gift there. Good. And I think God wants us to discover that with him.
Good. Yeah. Look for the gift in all of this. It is there. That's great, Tina. Thank you so much for being with me today. I really appreciate you reconnecting with you. And we need to do this more often. Say hello to your husband, Gary. And we wish you and pray for you and wish you all the best in this new season that you're in. And just really appreciate your investment in the coaching world, especially. And that goes for me personally as well, as you helped me start my journey way back when in the coaching world. So appreciate you. Thanks so much for being on the show today.
You're welcome, Tim. It's been a pleasure.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
I hope you've been encouraged by Tina's personal story and her insights. Whether transitions are forced upon us due to a personal health crisis like Tina's, or they come about by our own choosing, they can be tricky to navigate, but they are also treasure trove seasons waiting to be mined and discovered. Don't try to walk through this season alone. Reach out to a coach, a mentor, counselor, or spiritual director, and get the support you need to make your transition a success. Well, that wraps up this hour of Navigate. Make sure you head over to the show notes where you'll find the links to the resources mentioned on today's episode, as well as information on how to connect with Tina. And one final thing, if you feel like you have a personal story to tell that would encourage our listeners, we'd love to consider having you as a guest on Navigate. Just start by submitting a podcast guest inquiry form using the link provided in the podcast section of my website, EncompassLifeCoaching.com, right there on the homepage. Or feel free just to send me an email to tim@EncompassLifeCoaching.com. Thanks for listening in. I'm your host, Tim Austin, and I look forward to you joining me for the next episode of Navigate. Until next time.